I pushed him away, and my sister was waiting. If you're drawn to real stories of marriage betrayal and women finding their strength, you've found your tribe. Please like this video and subscribe to stay connected. I used to be someone who laughed easily. I remember standing in our kitchen in Austin, the morning light coming through the window, and Daniel looking at me like I was the only thing in the room that mattered. That was 8 years ago. 8 years, 2 apartments, 1 house, and somewhere along the way, I stopped being that woman. I don't know exactly when it happened. That's the honest truth, and it's the part that still keeps me up at night. Not the ending, but the fact that I can't pinpoint the beginning of my own unraveling. By the time we'd been married for 6 years, I had built a wall so high that even I couldn't see over it. I told myself it was exhaustion, work pressure, the weight of a life that looked perfect from the outside, but felt hollow the moment I closed the front door behind me. Daniel would ask how my day was, and I'd give him one word. He'd reach for my hand at dinner, and I'd move it to pick up my glass. Small things, quiet rejections. I didn't even realize I was doing them until they became the language of our marriage. He tried. I have to say that, because it's true, and because I owe him at least that much honesty now. Daniel tried in ways that should have broken through any wall. He left notes on the bathroom mirror. He booked a weekend in San Antonio without telling me, just to surprise me, just to try. I went, and I smiled when I was supposed to smile, and I came home feeling more disconnected than before. Looking back, I think I had already left, emotionally, completely, long before anything else happened. I was still sleeping in our bed, still sitting across from him at breakfast, still wearing my ring, but I was gone. And the worst part is that I let him keep trying, without ever telling him the truth. The truth was that I had met someone at work. Nothing physical, not then, but there were late nights, long conversations, a kind of attention that felt electric simply because it was new. I convinced myself it was innocent. I was careful with my words, careful with my phone, careful in the way people are when they know, deep down, that what they're doing is wrong, but haven't found the courage to stop. Daniel never accused me. He just got quieter. His eyes started carrying something I recognized as pain, but chose to ignore. My younger sister Natalie had moved in with us 3 months before everything collapsed. She needed a place to stay after her lease ended, and I said yes without thinking twice. I should have thought twice. I just didn't know then what that decision would cost all 3 of us. Natalie settled into our guest room, like she had always belonged there. She was 28, 4 years younger than me, and she carried that particular kind of lightness that people have when life hasn't fully pressed down on them yet. She cooked on weekends, left flowers on the kitchen counter, and filled the house with a noise I had forgotten we were missing. Daniel seemed to breathe easier when she was around. At the time, I told myself it was simply because the house felt less tense, less like a waiting room for something neither of us could name. I was traveling more for work by then. 3, sometimes 4 days a week in Dallas. Meetings that ran long. Dinners I didn't refuse, because they were easier than coming home to a husband I no longer knew how to talk to. I told myself Daniel understood. He was patient. He had always been patient. It was one of the first things I had loved about him, and one of the things that, somewhere along the way, had started to feel suffocating. He called every night I was away. I answered maybe half the time. On the nights I didn't answer, Natalie was there. I know that now. I know that. She told me later, during the worst conversation of my life, that she would find him sitting alone in the kitchen after dinner, not watching television, not on his phone, just sitting in the dark with a glass of water like a man waiting for a verdict. She said she started making tea and sitting with him, just talking, about nothing important at first. Her job search, a podcast she liked, a book he recommended. I didn't see it because I wasn't looking. I was too busy protecting something that wasn't even real. The man at work, his name doesn't matter now, had started texting me after hours. Nothing that could be held up as evidence in court, but everything that could be held up as evidence in a marriage. Words that existed in a space I had deliberately kept separate from my real life. I told myself I deserved that space. I had been unhappy for so long that I had started to confuse desire with survival. Daniel never went through my phone. He wasn't that kind of man. But one evening in October, I came home early from a trip that ended sooner than expected, and I walked into the kitchen to find him and Natalie laughing at something on her laptop. A genuine laugh, the kind I hadn't heard from him in over a year. They didn't hear me come in. I stood in the hallway for a moment longer than I should have. I didn't feel jealousy. Not then. What I felt was guilt, sudden and sharp, because the laugh I had just heard used to be mine to give him. and I had stopped giving it a long time ago. November arrived cold and indifferent. I was home more that month. The project in Dallas had wrapped, and I had no excuse to stay away. But being home only made the distance between Daniel and me more visible. We existed in the same space like two planets that had drifted out of each other's orbit, still bound by some faint gravitational pull, but no longer close enough to feel any warmth. Natalie moved carefully around us. She was perceptive in that quiet way some people are. She could read a room without anyone saying a word. She started spending more time in her bedroom when I was home, giving us space I suspect she sensed we weren't using. Daniel and I would sit at dinner and exchange the kind of conversation that couples have when they've run out of real things to say. The weather, a neighbor's renovation, whether we needed more coffee. I noticed he had stopped leaving notes on the bathroom mirror. I noticed, and I said nothing, because acknowledging it would have meant acknowledging everything else. One Thursday evening, I stayed late at my home office finishing a report. Around 10, I went downstairs for water and heard voices on the back porch. Low, unhurried voices, the kind people use when they feel safe. I stood at the kitchen window and watched Daniel and Natalie sitting in the porch chairs, mugs in hand, talking in the dark. There was nothing inappropriate in what I saw. No touch, no gesture that crossed any line. But there was something that gutted me completely. Ease. They were completely at ease with each other. I went back upstairs without getting my water. That night I lay beside Daniel and listened to him breathe, and tried to remember the last time I had chosen him, not tolerated him, not coexisted with him, actually chosen him, reached for him first, said something true instead of something safe. I couldn't remember, and instead of letting that realization crack something open in me, instead of rolling over and waking him up and telling him I was scared and lost and sorry, I picked up my phone. I opened a conversation I should have closed months earlier. I typed a message to a man who made me feel something, even if that something was borrowed and fragile and entirely wrong. I told myself I was just lonely, but loneliness doesn't excuse the choices we make inside it. I know that now. What I didn't know that night was that Daniel had woken up, that he had felt me reach for my phone in the dark, that he had lain there perfectly still, listening to the sound of my typing, staring at the ceiling with his eyes open. He told me all of this later. He said that was the night he stopped hoping, and in the space where his hope used to live, something else had quietly begun to grow. It was a Saturday in December when everything finally came apart at the seams. I had come home from what I told Daniel was a work lunch. It wasn't. It was 2 hours with a man I had no business spending 2 hours with, in a restaurant across town where I was certain no one would recognize me. Nothing happened. That was what I told myself in the car on the way home. Nothing happened. As though the intention behind the meeting didn't already constitute its own kind of betrayal. Daniel was in the living room when I walked in. He looked at me in a way he hadn't in months. Directly, steadily, without the usual retreat behind politeness. "Where were you?" he asked. The question was simple. His voice was calm, but there was something underneath it that I had never heard before. Not anger exactly, but the complete absence of the patience that had always softened him. I told him I had been at lunch with a colleague. "Which colleague?" he said. I gave him a name, a woman's name. A name I chose in the 2 seconds between his question and my answer. He nodded slowly. Then he said, "Claire, I've been patient for a long time. I've been waiting for you to come back. But I need to know if there's still something here worth waiting for." I should have stopped. I should have sat down and told him the truth, and let whatever needed to break cleanly. Instead, something in me rose up, defensive and cornered and ugly. I told him he was being paranoid. I told him I was exhausted from carrying the weight of a marriage that felt like a performance. I told him that his neediness had been pushing me away for years. The words came out precise and aimed, and I watched them land. His face didn't crumble. It went still, which was worse. Natalie was home. Her bedroom was at the top of the stairs, and our voices had risen well past the point of privacy. I found out later that she had sat on the edge of her bed with her hands in her lap, listening, not moving. Daniel said one thing before he walked out of the room. He said, "I don't think you've been honest with me in a very long time, and I think you know that." He took his keys and drove away. I stood in the living room alone and felt something I hadn't expected. Not relief, not righteousness, but a deep and nauseating shame, the kind that doesn't announce itself loudly, the kind that settles into your bones and stays. I heard Natalie's door open softly at the top of the stairs. She didn't say anything. She just came down and sat beside me on the couch in the silence I had made. Natalie didn't ask questions that night. She made tea, the same way she always did, with too much honey and a patience that reminded me uncomfortably of Daniel. And she sat beside me on the couch while the house settled around us into quiet. I didn't cry. I was past the kind of pain that produces tears. What I felt was more like the aftermath of a storm, when the air is strange and still and everything looks slightly altered. "He loves you," Natalie said finally. Not as an accusation. As a fact, she was simply placing on the table between us. "I know," I said. "Do you love him?" I didn't answer right away. I turned the mug in my hands and looked at the wall, and tried to locate an honest answer somewhere inside myself. The silence went on long enough that it became its own response. Natalie looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something shift behind her eyes. Not judgment. Something more complicated than that. Something that, if I had been paying closer attention, I might have recognized as the beginning of a line being crossed. Daniel came home around midnight. He didn't speak to me. He went upstairs, and I heard the guest bathroom door close. Not slammed, just closed, and I understood that he had chosen a different room for the night. Natalie had gone to bed by then. I sat alone on the couch until almost 2 a.m, and then I went upstairs and lay in our empty bed and stared at the ceiling and tried to understand how I had become the villain of my own marriage. Over the following 2 weeks, a new pattern established itself in the house. Daniel and I moved around each other with a careful, exhausting politeness. We did not fight again. We did not discuss what had been said. We simply endured each other's presence with the strained civility of 2 people waiting for something to end, without wanting to be the one to end it. Natalie began spending more time with Daniel. I watched it happen, and told myself it was innocent. She was keeping him company. She felt sorry for him. She was my sister. There were things she simply would not do. But I also watched the way she listened to him, with her whole body, leaning slightly forward, eyes steady on his face. I recognized that kind of listening. It was the listening of someone who finds the other person genuinely fascinating. It was the way I had listened to Daniel in the first year of our relationship, before I had convinced myself I already knew everything he had to say. One evening I passed the kitchen doorway and saw him show her something on his phone, a photograph from a hiking trip he had taken years before we met. She was laughing. He was watching her laugh. I went to my office and called the man from work. I told myself I had no right to be jealous. I was right, but being right about that didn't make the feeling disappear. It only made me more ashamed of having it. January came in gray and relentless. I found the first sign on a Wednesday morning, entirely by accident. I was looking for my car keys and checked the kitchen counter, the hallway table, the coat rack, the usual places. Daniel's jacket was hanging by the door, and without thinking, I reached into the pocket. No keys, but my fingers found something else. A receipt from a coffee shop 3 blocks from our house. 2 Americanos. A Wednesday. The same Wednesday 2 weeks earlier when Daniel had told me he was working late. I stood there holding that small piece of paper and told myself it meant nothing. People have coffee. People have colleagues and friends and sisters-in-law they happen to take for coffee when a marriage is falling apart around them. I put the receipt back. I found my keys on the bathroom counter where I had left them myself, but I didn't stop thinking about it. I began paying attention in a way I hadn't allowed myself to before. Not because I had any moral ground to stand on. I was fully aware that I didn't, but because something animal and frightened had woken up inside me, and it was not interested in fairness. It was only interested in what was happening in my own house. I noticed that Natalie had started wearing her hair down. A small thing. She had always kept it pulled back. I noticed that when the 3 of us were in a room together, she and Daniel did not look at each other too much, which I realized was itself a kind of looking. I went through her phone while she was in the shower. I am not proud of that. I include it because this is a true account, and true accounts require the parts that reflect badly on the person telling them. I scrolled quickly, hands steady in a way that surprised me. There were no explicit messages, nothing that a lawyer would call evidence, but there was a warmth in the exchanges that had no business being there. Small jokes. A voice message I didn't play. His name saved simply as Daniel, not as Claire's husband, not as any designation that acknowledged my existence in the architecture of their connection. I put her phone back exactly where I had found it. I sat on the edge of the guest bed, in the room that was supposed to be temporary, and looked at the small signs of her life arranged around it, her books, her scarves, a photograph of the 2 of us from years ago pinned to the wall, and I felt something collapse inside me. Not because my sister and my husband had betrayed me, but because I understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that I had left the door open. I had left it open and walked away, and expected it to stay closed on its own. I waited 4 days before I said anything. 4 days of watching them with new eyes, of sitting at the dinner table and measuring silences, of lying awake while Daniel slept in the guest room and constructing sentences I wasn't sure I had the right to speak. On a Sunday afternoon, I asked them both to sit down. They came into the living room separately, Natalie from the kitchen, Daniel from upstairs, and when they saw each other already there, something passed between them. A fractional adjustment, a careful neutrality that people adopt when they've been practicing it. I didn't scream. I want to be clear about that, because I think people expect screaming, and I understand why. But I had spent the previous 4 days moving past the part that wanted to scream and arriving at something colder and more precise. I told them what I knew. The coffee shop, the phone, the voice message I hadn't played but knew existed. Daniel didn't deny it. He looked at me with eyes that were exhausted and sad and something else, something that looked almost like relief that the waiting was over. Natalie started to cry, quietly, with her hands in her lap, in the way of someone who has been anticipating this moment and is not surprised by its arrival. Daniel spoke first. His voice was even, measured. He said that he and Natalie had crossed a line, not the physical line I was imagining, not yet, but a line nonetheless, an emotional one. He said he hadn't planned it, hadn't wanted it, and had spent weeks trying to understand how a man who had loved his wife for nearly 10 years had arrived in a place like this. Then he looked at me and said something I will carry for the rest of my life. He said, "I didn't go looking for this, Claire. I was just so tired of being invisible in my own house." Natalie said my name once. I held up my hand and she stopped. What followed was not a clean confrontation. It was not the kind of scene where someone says the perfect thing and the truth arranges itself into something bearable. It was an hour of broken sentences and long silences, and 3 people sitting with the wreckage of decisions that had compounded over years until the structure finally gave way. I told Daniel about the man from work. All of it. Every message. Every dinner. Every lie. I don't know exactly why I chose that moment. Perhaps because holding it any longer felt like a physical impossibility, or perhaps because I understood that if I was going to demand honesty, I had to be willing to offer it first. The room went very quiet. Daniel nodded slowly, the way he did when he was absorbing something that hurt. Then he stood up, picked up his keys from the table, and walked out the front door. Natalie and I sat in silence for a long time. Neither of us could offer the other any comfort. We had both run out of the currency required for that. Daniel didn't come back that night. He came back the following morning, just after 7, when the light was still thin and the house had the particular stillness of a place holding its breath. I was sitting at the kitchen table with cold coffee and no sleep behind me. He came in without knocking. It was still his house, and stopped when he saw me. He looked like a man who had spent the night making a decision. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." I nodded. He sat down across from me and folded his hands on the table the way he did when he was trying to stay calm. Then he told me that what had happened between him and Natalie had gone further than I knew. Not everything, but further. A night, 2 weeks earlier, when I had been in Dallas, and the house had been quiet, and 2 people who were both drowning had made a choice they couldn't take back. The kitchen felt very small. I didn't scream. I had no screaming left. What I felt was a cold, clarifying rage, the kind that doesn't burn. It cuts. I looked at this man I had married, and I saw clearly, perhaps for the first time in years, exactly where we were. Not because of that one night, because of every night before it, every choice I had made, every door I had left open and walked away from. "You need to leave," I said. My voice was steady. That surprised both of us. "Claire, I'm not saying it in anger, Daniel. I'm saying it because it's true. This is over. We both know it's been over. But now it's done." He sat there for a long moment. Then he stood, went upstairs, and I heard him moving through the bedroom, drawers opening, a bag being packed. Each sound landed in my chest like something final. When he came back downstairs, he stopped in the doorway. "I didn't want it to end like this," he said. "Neither did I said. "But we both built this ending, one day at a time." He left. The door closed behind him. I called Natalie 20 minutes later. She answered on the second ring, which told me she had been waiting. I told her I knew everything. The silence on her end was long and awful. Then she started to cry, and I let her, because stopping her would have required a generosity I didn't have access to yet. When she stopped, I said, "I need you to give me time. A lot of it. Don't call me. Don't explain. Just give me time." She said she would. I hung up and sat in the silence of a house that had just become entirely mine, and felt the full weight of everything I had set in motion. Not just in the last few months, but in the last few years. Every withdrawal, every ignored call, every night I chose distance over truth. The consequences were not a surprise. They were just finally, completely, here. I gave myself 40 days. No explanations to friends. No dramatic announcements. No performance of recovery. Just 40 days inside my own life, with the doors closed and the noise turned down, learning what it felt like to exist, without running from myself. The first week was the hardest. The house was so quiet it felt hostile. I would wake at 3 a.m. with my heart going fast and the sheets tangled, and a specific kind of dread that has no name. Not grief exactly, not guilt exactly, but something that lived in the space between them. I would lie there in the dark and make myself stay. No phone, no distraction, just the dark and whatever it brought with it. It brought plenty. It brought the memory of Daniel's face the night I had called him paranoid. The look he hadn't flinched from, hadn't thrown back at me, had simply absorbed with the quiet endurance of a man who had been absorbing things for years. It brought the image of Natalie at the kitchen table the night of the confrontation, hands in her lap, crying without making a sound. It brought every version of myself I had been choosing not to look at. I started writing things down, not in any formal way, just words on paper in the middle of the night when sleep wouldn't come. Sentences that started with, "I chose" instead of "he made me," or "things just happened." It was uncomfortable in a way I hadn't anticipated. Owning your choices, really owning them, is a different thing from acknowledging them in the abstract. It has weight. It sits on your chest. By the second week, I had called a therapist, Dr. Reyes. She had a cancellation on Thursday mornings, and I took it. In our first session, she asked me what I wanted from therapy. I told her I wanted to understand how I had become someone capable of what I had done. She nodded and said, "That's an honest place to start." It was the first time in a long time that honesty had felt like something other than a weapon. The 40th day fell on a Saturday. I woke before sunrise and made coffee, and took it out to the back porch, and sat in the chair where I had once watched Daniel and Natalie talk in the dark. The yard was beginning to show the first signs of spring, something green and tentative pushing through the ground along the fence line. My phone showed a message from Natalie. She hadn't called. She had respected what I asked. The message was 4 words. "Thinking of you today." I didn't reply, but I didn't delete it either. I sat there until the sun was fully up, and I let the light come without reaching for anything to fill the quiet. No phone, no noise, no version of myself performing okayness for an audience that wasn't there. Just me, just the morning, just the slow, unglamorous, necessary work of beginning again. The anger was still there. I won't pretend it wasn't. But underneath it, for the first time in longer than I could remember, something else was there too. Something that felt, cautiously and without certainty, like the first outline of solid ground. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after Daniel left. I had been expecting them. I had even, in a strange way, been waiting for them, the way you wait for a fever to break, knowing the discomfort of the moment is necessary for what comes after. I set them on the kitchen table and looked at them for a long time before I touched them. Daniel's attorney had been thorough and fair. No cruelty in the language, no inventory of grievances, just the clean legal geography of an ending. I called my own attorney that afternoon. She confirmed what I already knew. The terms were reasonable, more than reasonable. I asked her one question before we hung up. I asked whether, in her experience, people who went through something like this came out the other side as better versions of themselves, or just different ones. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The ones who ask that question usually find out." I signed the papers on a Friday. That evening, I drove to a part of Austin I didn't know well, and walked along the river until my feet ached, and the city lights came on around me, and the water went dark and silver. I thought about the woman I had been at the beginning of this story, the one who had stopped laughing, who had chosen silence over honesty and distance over the terrifying vulnerability of being truly known by another person. I thought about Daniel, not with longing, but with a clear-eyed sadness that felt appropriate. He had loved me with a consistency I had not deserved and had not known how to receive. I hoped he was somewhere that felt lighter, I hoped the exhaustion I had seen in his face for years was finally beginning to lift. I thought about Natalie. That one was more complicated and would remain so for a long time. She was my sister before she was anything else, and that fact was both the wound and the reason the wound might eventually close. We had spoken twice since I ended the 40 days of silence. Short conversations, careful ones, the kind that acknowledge damage without pretending it isn't there. We were not okay, but we were trying, which is the only honest thing either of us could offer. I stopped walking at a bench near the water and sat down and looked at the river moving past in the dark. Here is the truth I owe myself, and the only one that matters now. I did not lose my marriage because of Natalie. I did not lose it because Daniel eventually broke. I lost it because I dismantled it quietly and deliberately over years, one small betrayal of intimacy at a time, and then was shocked to find rubble where a foundation used to be. That is not a comfortable thing to carry. It was not meant to be, but it is mine. And carrying it honestly, without excuses, without revision, is the only way I know to make sure I never build something and abandon it again. The river kept moving. The city kept its noise. Somewhere across town, Daniel was living a life that no longer included me. Somewhere across town, Natalie was learning, as I was, what it means to sit with the consequences of your choices. And here, on this bench, in this city, on this ordinary Friday night, I was still here. Bruised, accountable, clearer than I had been in years. Beginning. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for watching until the end. Every like and subscription helps us share more powerful stories. See you soon with another unforgettable tale.